Hi, and welcome to Simply Christ. My name is Mark Shepard. This is where we explore the spiritual realm. We make Jesus Christ our master. It's about following the teachings of Jesus Christ. If you are not a subscriber, I would ask that you would do so. Hit the subscribe button, very easy to do so. Also, there's a share button. Share that with your friends, and also hit the like button. And finally, leave a comment. Appreciate if you would do so. We have some new subscribers. Welcome. We're glad that you're here, and I hope this is providing you with some insight in living the spiritual life. This channel for new members, new subscribers, people who are just following, and maybe individuals who are just curious and seeing what this is about. This is a different take, I guess you want to say, or what I want to say, on living for Christ in the sense of what we call Christianity. Many people are turned off by Christianity because of it's more of a religion, and maybe it doesn't really affect or do anything for them, and they leave and go follow Eastern religions, and for whatever reasons they may feel. And I think one of the reasons that they do so is there seems to be a lack of teaching among many Christians and in many Christian circles about what the spiritual life is and giving us real purpose and identity. This is what this channel is about. So subscribe. Let's get on to what we're going to be talking about. Today we are going to be talking about the cost of discipleship. Yes, there's a cost to being a disciple of Jesus. We don't like to really think about it in terms like that, because with many people, being a follower of Jesus just simply means that you have said a prayer, or one of my favorites I've seen sometimes in churches is everybody has their head down, and the minister will say, anybody want to accept Jesus, put your hand up, and or the hand will raise up, and there you go, God bless you, you're now saved, and everything's fine, and there's just go on your way, and there's nothing really expected to believe. And that's not what Jesus even talks about. Any cursory review of the New Testament, any of Jesus's teachings that we look at, the teachings of the first century Christians, we find out that there is a lot more to being a Christian than doing a ritual or going to some church or doing some kind of, saying some kind of prayer or magical word and following the dictates and the dogma of the church. Today, we're going to be looking at several passages of Scripture. The first one we're going to be looking at is in Luke. I am following in the ARAMAIC scriptures. There's a link at the bottom. I like the ARAMAIC simply because it has the language that Jesus spoke, most likely spoke. It's the common language of the day. So if you want to get kind of an idea of what they spoke, which is ARAMAIC, follow this. Now, whether Jesus actually spoke that, it's hard to be seen. But I did not know. I do know he didn't speak English, so whatever translation you're using, I'm sure it's going to be fine if it's a good translation. So I like the ARAMAIC. It helps along. Let's jump into it. And while going, many crowds were with him. He turned and said to him and to them, whoever comes unto me and doesn't hate his father and his mother and his brothers and his sisters and his wife and his children and even himself isn't able to be a disciple for me. And he who doesn't take up his cross and comes after me isn't able to be a disciple for me. For who from you who desires that he should build a tower and doesn't first sit down and consider its cost, if he has enough to complete it, lest when he shall lay the foundation and isn't able to complete it, all who see it will be laughing at him. And they will say, that man began to build and wasn't able to complete it. Or which king who goes to war to fight with a neighboring king doesn't first consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet that one who comes against him with 20,000. Yet if not, while he is far away from him, he sends envoys and seeks for peace. Thus, everyone from you who doesn't leave all his possessions isn't able to be a disciple for me. It's a pretty tall order. That's not a raise your hand, say the Lord's Prayer, and voila, everything's fine, everything's good. Now, it's not to say that you work for your salvation or work your way into heaven. We need to understand what salvation is in the first place. Let me just give you a little bit of a definition of salvation. There are really two different salvations, if you think about it. The first salvation is the one where we pass on, we go be with the Father. But there's also another salvation that takes place, and that salvation is one that changes our being in our life. We're saved from an addiction. We're saved from a bad way of living. We're saved and taken into a new way. So we're rescued out of that. We'll talk about that some other time, but I want us to understand that that is what it really is. So there's that salvation involved in that, and that'll come into play here in just a minute. Yet Jesus here is making a very important statement to these people, and how he does it is the key. The verse to really focus on at the very beginning is this first verse right here in verse 25. And while going, many crowds were with him. He turned and said unto them. So picture in your mind what is taking place. Here you have Jesus. He has all the crowds following him. Now, it was common in those days for a leader, a rabbi, to have people follow him. And these rabbis and leaders were teaching people about messianic things, about the Messiah, or living the law, or all kinds of different things. They were all of a spiritual nature in a sense, or should be in a spiritual nature. Most of them were. What kind of spirit? Well, yet to be determined, and lots of discussion. But anyways, it was very common for people to be following their rabbi or their teacher, and Jesus was a rabbi. In fact, Mary says Rabboni when she saw him after he raised from the dead. He was a rabbi, so he's a teacher. He's teaching these individuals, and he's giving them, like, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount and all these different lessons. And he's going and they're following him, and he suddenly turns around and tells them, read this verse again here. And while going, many crowds were with him. He turned and said unto them. I get the impression Jesus has all these people following. They think they're following and doing what they're supposed to be doing, yet he turns around and he hits them between the eyes with something. And he doesn't mince words. In fact, I think he goes to the extremes to show the importance of what it really means to be a follower of his. Let's look at the next verse here. Whoever comes to me, verse 26, and doesn't hate his father and his mother and his brothers and his sisters and his wife and his children and even himself isn't able to be a disciple for me. And he who doesn't take up his cross and comes after me isn't able to be a disciple for me. What Jesus is doing, first of all, here, he's showing people and showing us today that commitment is easy. It's the follow-through that's difficult. It's easy to say a Lord's Prayer. It's easy to do a ritual. And many people will do that. They will go in, they'll recite their prayers. I mean, I think we've all been to churches before where people will light a candle, they'll do their rituals, say their things, take their communion, take their bread, and walk out the door, and that's it. And the real dedicated ones will believe strongly in the church dogma. But is that really a commitment toward anything? Because the commitment only holds true, or the dedication, I should say, only holds true and is tested true when it's put under stress. And Jesus throws a lot of stress at these individuals. Look what he tells these people here. He says, if you don't hate your father, your mother, your brother, your sisters, and your wife, your children, and even himself, you cannot be my disciple. Now, is Jesus really telling us that you have to hate your mom? So that means tomorrow you become a Christian, you pick up the phone and say, hey, Mom, just want to let you know I became a Christian. I hate you. Oh, Dad, I hate you too. And your wife, who's a good, loving wife, loves you, takes care of you, helps you, or your husband, whatever the case is, you're married to this individual, and then suddenly you tell them after you become a Christian, I hate you, I can't stand the sight of you, get out of here. And not only do I hate you, I hate my children, and I hate myself. No, Jesus isn't saying that. Jesus is pushing. He's pushing the limit here. He's telling these individuals that you've really got to be serious with this. Because look at the next verse of what he says here. And he who doesn't take up his cross and comes after me isn't able to be a disciple for me. Jesus is telling these things to people not after he had been executed, but before he had been executed. These people had no idea he's going to be executed on a cross and raised from the dead in 3 days. They didn't know. Oh, he left some vague teaching on those, but most people didn't have any idea of what he was talking about until after it happened. And when you hear of a Roman cross in that day, Roman crosses were horrible executions. I mean, there's stories of a husband and wife who survived for days hanging on a cross. They were not very pretty ways of execution. And the Jewish people of his day knew what that was like. They knew that they probably saw the crosses from the executions before that the Romans did. I mean, Roman execution was pretty common, especially for people who were zealots or thieves or people who were a trouble to the Roman Empire. So it wasn't very uncommon for them. So Jesus not only tells them now they got to hate all their parents and their kids and themselves, but now they got to go pick up a cross and follow me. That's some pretty strong words. And then he goes on in the next verses. He starts talking about, and let's jump down to verse 30. And they will say, that man began to build and wasn't able to complete it. Or which king who goes to war to fight with a neighboring king doesn't first consider whether he is able to, with 10,000, to meet that one who comes against him with 20,000? Yet if not, while he is far from him, he sends envoys and seeks for peace. Thus, everyone from you who doesn't leave all his possessions isn't able to be a disciple for me. So Jesus says, dropped a bomb on 3 areas here. And the 3 areas that he talks about is about leaving all your possessions, hating all your family, and willing to be executed on a cross. Now, how tough is that? How difficult when you read those things? How difficult is it to want to follow that? Does that mean that all disciples of Jesus are going to be executed on a cross? They surely didn't think that, or at least they were hoping not. So he's telling these individuals that they have to understand that when you're being a follower of Jesus, when you're being a follower of his, you've got to be willing not only to do that, but give up the possessions as well. So give up everything. The point Jesus is making here is about seriousness and commitment and dedication to the spiritual life, to being a disciple of his. No Christianity, no lukewarm Christianity. You're either hot or cold. By the way, the hot and cold that we talk about, that comes from a stream in the vicinity. There was hot water that came in. It was known for its very refreshing. It was hot water, kind of like going into a sauna, and people would go there and refreshing waters of the warm. And then there was some very cold waters, so you could go next into the cold waters, and people would take these cold baths, not like an ice bath, but kind of like what an ice bath people do an ice bath today. But so those two were good for healing properties. But what was lukewarm is they all came down to a point where they mixed together. They were lukewarm. They were neither hot nor cold. They were not good for anything. So Jesus doesn't want lukewarm Christians. He wants you to either be a hot Christian, providing that kind of healing properties, or he wants you to be a cold Christian, not a cold person where you're not a good person, but providing cold waters, not lukewarm, because you're not good for anything. It's about the level of commitment that you have and the level of dedication that you have toward the discipleship, or being a disciple of his, a follower of his. Do we want to follow our master? Do we hear our master's voice? Which leads me to the next point. Discipleship is lonely. Discipleship can be very lonely. In fact, some of the greatest teachers, the greatest followers of Jesus were sometimes some of the most loneliest. And why is that? It's because whenever we decide to take a new life into living the spiritual life, we are going to go into a door that's very, very, very small and enter into a way that's very, very narrow. Sound familiar? Good. Let's turn right now to Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Jesus says, "Enter in the narrow gate, because broad is the gate and wide is the way that leads into destruction, and many are those who go in it. How small the gate and narrow the way that leads unto life, and few are those who find it." Few are those who find it. I used to think this was talking about when you die, you go to heaven, this is what it's about. And I'm sure that's part of it too, don't misunderstand me, but I want us to take another look at it. Let's tack it in a different way. When we become followers of Jesus, we go into a narrow gate. That narrow gate, that small gate, that entry takes us onto a narrow way. That is the Christian lifestyle, the Christian spiritual life. The spiritual way is living in a different plane that's narrow, not narrow-minded, but narrow in the sense that it demands spiritual guidance, it demands spiritual maturity, it demands our discussions with God, hearing from God, making decisions, wisdom, spiritual wisdom. It demands all those things. And when we do those things, we're going to find out that there's not many people who are on that path. Jesus himself said that. So the person who becomes a true dedicated disciple, they're first learning about all these things, they're excited, but the deeper they get into it, they're going to find out that the ranks start to thin out. And you'll be ostracized. Many times, people who go deeper into the spiritual life find out that their families reject them. They want nothing to do with them. They'll say things like, you were such a dedicated Christian. And what they're really saying is that you were dedicated to our church dogma, our church teaching. Yet Jesus isn't wanting people who are dedicated to church dogma. He wants people who are dedicated to listening and hearing from him and producing the spiritual life, the spiritual fruit, living the spiritual life, producing peace and patience and kindness and gentleness, in living out in this other world. And people are going to think you're weird. Don't be surprised. The deeper you get into this, the more even your church members and your pastor even, the elders of the church, your pastor, your deacons, your ministers will look at you and say, going a little kind of weird there, aren't you? Well, why are you going a little weird? Don't be surprised, to ask yourself these questions. Are you going weird because you're chasing maybe some new agey thing? Or are you just getting deeper into the church and the church is not really ready for that? There are not many people who find that way. And Jesus says that. We should not be surprised at that, but we are surprised by it because we get lonely. The Christian life can be a very lonely life in the sense of other people. Yet, Jesus provides more brothers, more sisters, more family. We get those because we enter into a new realm, and then we start seeing God bringing people into our life to help shape us. It was the way with me. Some of you know my background. I grew up in a very, very fundamental church, and it's very fundamental. In fact, you had to have the right name on the door, and if you don't have the right name on the door, and if you don't follow the same precepts that all the other churches of that group, the denomination, they don't call themselves a denomination, but they are. If you don't follow that, you're not a Christian, and they will cast you out. And it's not so much a give you a letter and kick you out the door, but it's like, yeah, that's so-and-so. Well, he doesn't need to be teaching anything anymore. That individual, yeah, they're kind of odd. You get ignored. And pretty soon you find out even your family members are doing that. That's common. Look at Jesus. It happened to Jesus too. He's the creator of this world, and he wasn't even have a place to lay his head down. Next week we're going to look at Luke. We're going to explain some of the things that he talks about in Luke about discipleship and commitment and dedication. So don't be surprised if the spiritual life finds you a little bit lonely with people. But the good news is when you're in the spiritual life, you are now hearing God's voice. And if you have not listened to our video on hearing God's voice, we have some videos on that. Check those out. Again, link in the description below. You'll see those. Check those out. And I'm going to tell you something. When you hear God's voice speaking to you, it makes no difference where you're at. You're at peace. Exactly where you're at. You're at peace. Philippians even talks about that. Don't be anxious for anything, but in everything with praise and thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Why do you get that peace? Because when you're presenting that, God is reflecting and talking back to you, and you have communion with God. So you're not ever lonely. You might be the outcast of the church. People may not want to talk to you, and don't be surprised about that. Don't be surprised if you go to church and you find you don't fit in anymore. And I want to throw a caveat on here, okay? A caveat is that if you're feeling that you're left out, but you're feeling because you're more spiritual than other, backtrack, stop, go back. There's a humility lessons that need to be learned, okay? There's a lot of people who becomes very high and mighty in their spiritual walk. Well, I'm more spiritual than so-and-so. No, just means you may see some things in a different way, but the humility branch needs to be pruned. I know I get that all the time from me. God's always pruning that tree from me, or pruning those branches. It's good to be pruned. We want to be pruned. That's what God wants to do with us. He wants to prune us. He wants to prune us to make him more like you. That's that narrow way. But many people don't like pruning. They resist it. They're committed to their church teaching, but they're not dedicated to the discipleship part of it. So don't be surprised if you're lonely. Some of the people in the past that were some of the loneliest people were individuals that were the deep spiritual people of their day. There's many people. For instance, you'll hear the term mystic. Okay, and stop right there. Time out. I know some people hear the word mystic. Oh boy, what does that mean? Because there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. And we are going to be doing a video just on mysticism, okay? I don't like the word mysticism for a lot of reasons. But basically all mysticism is we are hearing the mysteries and experiencing the mysteries of Christ. So if a person goes around saying they're a mystic, that throws a red flag to me. It's kind of arrogant in my opinion. But the ones who are true mystics, if you want to call it that, the ones who are hearing about from God, are the ones that never call them that. Again, we'll talk about that some other time, but those individuals that are in that position of seeing the mysteries were the ones that were burned at the stake. They were seen as heretics for 1,500 years. They were seen as heretics. They were burned at the stake, executed, sawn asunder. All kinds of things happened to them because they experienced God in a different way from what their religion or their church taught them. So don't be surprised at that. And of course, we have those individuals who, if you're living in a foreign country, and I know some of you have lost all your friends and family simply because you decided to become a follower of Jesus and they did not like your religious conversion and you're outcast there. Of course, that's true as well. So don't be surprised if you lose family members, but don't worry. The great reward is God's going to lead you to people who's going to encourage you. And more importantly, he's going to be with you to where you feel his presence, you know his presence, and you have a peace and joy. It's great. I would rather have the peace and the joy of God speaking to me and communing with me and being with me everywhere, waking me up 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the middle of the night to talk to him because he wants something to tell me. I'd give that than to have a church full of 1,000 people who are all my friends any day of the week. So don't be surprised. The third thing we're going to talk about and understand what Jesus is saying here is we have to have an absolute surrender. Absolute surrender in everything that we have, all our possessions, everything. But what does that mean? Thus, everyone from you who doesn't leave all his possessions isn't able to be a disciple for me. Now, is Jesus telling us you've got to hold a great big garage sale or just sell everything that you have? Can't sell it, after all, because then you'd have money and it'd be a possession. Is Jesus telling us to get rid of everything? No, Jesus isn't telling us to get rid of everything and go live under an underpass in a cardboard box. Even then, hey, we'd have a cardboard box and it'd be a possession. We'd have clothes, it'd be a possession, wouldn't it? So what is Jesus really saying here? What's he trying to make the point? Is he making the point that we're supposed to run around naked and live under a tree? No. He's saying that if your possessions are controlling you, you've got to get rid of them. You've got to get rid of the possession of that. So you can still get rid of the possession or those possessions, but still be possessed by them. And Jesus is again pushing the extreme to show people you've got to get rid of the things that you're holding on that you think that you're not holding on to. We all like to say that we don't worship our goods. I mean, after all, we think that, well, if we lost them, yeah, it'd be terrible. But would it be? Would we really feel that way? Would we? We'd have to think about that. If we lost everything today that we had, if your house burned down, everything you own, some of you lost that. You know that feeling. It's a bad feeling. how would we really think about it? How would we react? Would we have like a, yeah, it's sad, but it's God's anyways. There's a story of the man who driving a car and goes through the intersection. Somebody runs him, totals his car, gets out. The man scratches his head, looks at his car that the other person just hit. And, the policeman comes up and he's okay with it. And the policeman says, "You're kind of happy about it." He says, "Well, it's not my car." So, "Oh, well, no wonder you're okay with it." And he says, "But wait a minute, your registration says it belongs to you." "Oh, that's just on paper." "Well, who does it belong to?" He says, "That's God's car, not my car." It's his car. He's just letting me borrow it, so I'm sure he'll take care of it, take care of the situation. That's the attitude Jesus wants us to have. See the level of dedication he wants us to have? So again, those three things. It's about having the right dedication. It's easy to have commitment. It's difficult to have the true dedication to living it. It's also the understanding that discipleship can be lonely. And also, discipleship demands complete surrender of all our things and very being. Where are we in our discipleship process? It's something to really think about, isn't it? Jesus is making it very clear that this world of living as a follower of his is not about Sunday worship services and being good people. It's not about saying the right church dogma or doctrine. It's about being committed to him 100%, 110%, to where everything we have is his, where we would even pick up a cross and die if we had to. That's a tall order, isn't it? Next week, we're going to look at Luke chapter 9 and discuss some of the same things, but just with some different verses and looking at it in maybe in even a more deeper sense. Again, if you have not subscribed, please do so. It's important. We are also going to have merchandise, some merchandise to sell on my website. We're going to probably set it up here, not on YouTube, but on the website. And the reason we're going to do that is this. We are going to be holding a discipleship seminar in India coming in September or in October. All the proceeds that we sell, every bit of it goes strictly to the trip, and it's a very frugal trip, okay? It's none of this very nice living. It's very right to the point. I love going to the remote areas where nobody goes. That is what I like. If I throw a backpack on and I go with a stick, I go. And I take a friend of mine who is from India. He lives in India, and he goes with me, and he helps set things up. And we go talk to disciples and bring this message of discipleship, of keeping it simply Christ. We've done this in the past, and it's mind-blowing to see how people react to it. They love it, they see it, and they grasp it. So those proceeds will go. We'll have more about that. But in the meantime, subscribe, share, like, comment, do all those things. We'll see you next time.